Thank you so much, Natasha. I know that a lot of people, especially within the Central American context or Latin American context, will get a better understanding with that explanation that you just gave us. The other question I have for you, in every movement we have leaders, and you just mentioned that the leaders are women. And normally in the history, women are always invisible, and we know that women are doing, a hell of a job. So could you, I don't know if you will be able to speak to us a little about these women and if you know their names so that they could be mentioned so that they stay in record.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And you're right. You're right about the idea about women, particularly Black women, who are in positions of leadership and power and who are using their voices. There's a lot of controversy, right? I mean, so we have three women specifically. We have Alicia Garza, and she was the first woman who, Black woman, she was the first woman who actually, when Trayvon was killed, put on Facebook the hashtag Black Lives Matter. So she was sort of the initiator of this movement, right? In terms of social media. And then it picked up and now it actually became a political entity and organization. Then you have Patricia Cullors. So Patricia Cullors is specifically, is also part of the trio who initiated the movement and is considered the leadership. And she specifically works with prison abolition. The idea that there are an extraordinary, inordinate amount of Black and Brown people who are in the prison system for minor offenses. And they're getting lifetime, they're getting all kinds of harsh charges. And they're also, the real big issue is that they're not getting fair trials. Why? Because what ends up happening is they don't have the money to pay bail. So they end up sitting because of poverty. They end up sitting in prison for a long time and never coming to trial. Or what they do is somebody comes in and says, okay, sign this paper, you'll get 3 years and then you'll come out, even if they're innocent. So they never get a trial. And that is the punishment for being poor and not properly represented. So she works in that Patricia Cullors. And I want to say Alicia Garza is very much an activist against police brutality. So she's one of the people who are sort of framing, she's the interim director right now, and she's really framing this idea about defund the police, right? And I'll talk a little bit more about that concept in a second. And then the third person is a Nigerian American. Her name is Opal Tamati, and she specifically deals with immigration, right? Who gets allowed in, who gets kicked out, and then obviously the way that the private immigration centers are virtually prisons, but the government in the United States pays for a head count. So basically, they keep immigrants who may undocumented immigrants, if they get on a plane, a boat, or however they come in, they keep them in these detention centers. But the incentive, right? Particularly, let's say you're a tiny Midwestern town, and the only thing going for a job is to work as a guard in the detention center. Then the last thing you're going to do is you're going to be interested in it closing down because that is the source of food for the entire community. So you have all these detention centers that are privately owned, that are basically funding towns, and the government pays a quota per head for how many people are there. So these people are literally not deported on a plane or put back. Sometimes they are kept months and months, and it is a prison. They are in cages. They do not have free movement. They have very little representation, and they are sort of stateless. They can't move left, they can't move right unless somebody advocates for them. So those three people specifically are the original sort of mothers of the movement, right? And there are two things I want to talk about in terms of defund the police, this concept. People think that defund the police means there's going to be no police. The United States, I'm sorry, is never going to give up its police force and its ability it's just never going to happen. But what they're talking about is really the divest, invest concept. It is like, okay, if you have a budget of $10 million a year for police training and salaries and everything else, Cut it in half and think about subsidizing something else. You do not have to put so much money. It's basically like your own military or militia, right? These sophisticated weapons, et cetera, et cetera. And also invest in training. How is it possible? Yesterday we had Jacob Blake, father of 5, going to his car, and cops came and they shot him 7 times in the back. How is it possible? In front of everybody. I mean, there were witnesses, there were videos. The man is paralyzed, barely hanging on for his life. In front of his children shot. The man had nothing, nothing. No drugs, no weapons. He was simply going to his car and he was shot. And so that's what they're talking about in terms of defunding the police. Automatically, people are trigger happy. What does that mean? It literally means that before I'm going to give you a warning, before I'm going to talk about human dignity, I'm going to use my gun because I see you as a threat. And in actuality, Black people have been trained. When the cop comes, it means you could die. There is no threat. We are just trying to stay alive. So there is no threat. We know that unless we're going to go out like, we want to shoot up everybody and we understand it's a suicide mission, most people are going to be like, hands up, I'm not doing anything. The man had his hands up and he was still shot in the back 7 times. It's unbelievable the level of violence that gets actuated day after day after day after day on Black and brown bodies. It's unbelievable. And one of the other things about the leader that I just want to say this is the idea of Black women in leadership is really interesting because a lot of the critique right now is sort of coming from older generation. So I would say hip hop generation, particularly so people who are in the hip hop generation, let's say who are in their late 40s, early 50s, right? And that would be sort of the older generation of hip hop, particularly men, are not in vocal support of these women. And it's because of homophobia. All 3 of these women are gay Black women, right? And part of their mission specifically was not only supporting Trayvon Martin with all Black Lives Matter, but also Black trans lives matter. And that was definitely part of their agenda when they started 7 years ago. Right now it's morphed into so many other things, but a lot of the critique is coming from inside of a sort of a very homophobic, older community of men. And it's interesting because I'm like, okay, you're critiquing, but are you stepping up to do the work?
Mm-hmm.
Somos voces de la historia, sangre, tinta y papel. Somos voces de la historia, mis ancestros, su saber, mis ancestros, su saber, mis ancestros, su saber. Ao, y ao.